Next set of best practices include using different Power BI gateways for direct query and schedule refresh. As you know, when we schedule a refresh using a gateway, it logs the database for the time the refresh is in progress, just to ensure there is no dirty read in the system. At the same time, if there are certain direct query in your visuals and which refreshes data directly using the gateway from the database, then there are cases where the visuals do not render well and it does not show up well on the screen. So the preferred mechanism to get this going is have a separate gateway, one for the schedule refresh and one for the direct query. So when there is a read which has to happen as a direct query, it can parallelly query to the database and it would ensure that the value is returned back and rendered in Power BI report. So a preferred way of doing things would be keeping the direct query gateway and the schedule refresh gateway separate, speaking to the same data set in the database, and then achieve the purpose of refresh and fetching the data both. Also, testing each custom visual on report for performance to ensure fast report load time, and use an alternative visual if the chosen visual performs poorly. So for every visual which you put on your screen, there is always a check on the performance of that visual to render the content and basis the volume and the scale of the data. If that visualization renders well and there is no performance lag on your report, then then you can continue using it. However, if there is a problem with the visual which delays the rendering of the content on the screen, then it is ideally advised to change the visual with a similar visual looking visual and achieve the reporting need. Then, avoiding complicated measures and aggregations in the data models. What this means is when we have measures which are calculated with huge formulas and aggregation done over different data tables in your data source, it is advised that to move these calculations off the Power BI desktop and Power BI space and do these changes, modifications on the data source at the data source level. The idea is all the further the calculation are from the Power BI and closer they are to the data source, the faster is the performance and access of the data. Use slicers sparingly. So, although slicers are the great filtering mechanism on our screen, we've seen it in the demo for so many times that they are one of the ways in which you filter the data onto your desktop. However, every slicer has two parallel running queries. The first data set will bring all the content of the slicer, and the second query would filter the data and then display it. So, as the number of slicers increases, the performance of your Power BI report and dashboard would drastically reduce. Therefore, use slicers sparingly. Ensure that Power BI report and data source are in the same region. With this, we mean that whichever region you select while deploying your Power BI desktop application or Power BI app, please ensure that they are hosted in the same Microsoft geographic region, which the closer the data and the reports are to each other, the faster and is the refreshes and the direct queries and therefore a better performance. Import only necessary fields and tables instead of entire dataset. So a usual practice, while any naive developer or a business designer would do, is bring all the data from the data source onto your Power BI desktop for the convenience of availability of all content and therefore help the designer design the Power BI reports faster. However, if the number of tables are huge, then it leads to multiple problems. One would be the size of the data which is shared over the network during every refresh. At the same time, default relationships being auto developed in the system during the import, like we saw, is one. And there would be a case wherein a redundant or a non-required or a half-baked table would be used by some other developer using the same Power BI desktop file, therefore causing issues in calculation. So the idea is in order to reduce the network dependency and the load, to reduce the confusion amongst what table, what measures to use, it is fair to ask the developer or designer to import and use only those content which are ideally getting used in the system, and exclude all those data tables and different data sources which are not required in the report. This increases the usage, the performance of Power BI report. Ensure that cache update frequency aligns with the data source refresh frequency. So the settings of cache, which we need to ensure that it is in line with the data refresh frequency. If the cache frequency is lesser than if it is higher, in other words, it infrequently updates itself, then there are high chances of data getting displayed in an irregular fashion, leading to confusions.